I stood outside Dante Salvatore's penthouse at 2 in the morning, with blood dripping from my split lip onto the collar of what used to be a $3,000 Valentino dress, now torn at the shoulder and stained with the kind of terror that no dry cleaner in Manhattan could ever remove. And I realized with a clarity that felt like swallowing glass that I had become exactly the kind of woman I swore I would never be. Desperate, broken, and crawling back to the one man I had spent 3 years trying to forget. The rain hammered down on the private rooftop entrance with the kind of violence that matched the thundering of my heart, each drop feeling like an accusation, a reminder that I had made my choices, and now I was living with the consequences of thinking I could outsmart fate, outrun destiny, escape the gravitational pull of a man who had once promised me the world and delivered it wrapped in blood and devotion. My hands trembled as I raised them to knock, but the door swung open before my knuckles could make contact with the dark wood. And there he was, Dante Salvatore, the man I had married in a fever dream of passion and left in a nightmare of fear, standing in the doorway like a dark angel of vengeance, his obsidian eyes traveling over my battered form with an intensity that made me feel simultaneously exposed and protected, judged and understood. He had changed in the 3 years since I had seen him last, or perhaps he had simply become more of what he always was, harder, colder, more dangerously refined like a blade that had been sharpened on the whetstone of my absence. His black hair was longer now, touching the collar of his charcoal dress shirt that was unbuttoned at the throat, revealing the edge of the tattoo that I knew covered his chest, the one that spelled out his family motto in Latin script that I had once traced with my fingers in the aftermath of our lovemaking. The scar on his left cheek, a memento from a rival family's assassination attempt that had happened 2 months before our wedding, seemed more pronounced now, cutting through his aristocratic features like a signature, a reminder that beauty and brutality could coexist in the same vessel. He did not look surprised to see me standing there, bleeding and desperate on his doorstep, and that realization sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the rain soaking through my ruined dress, and everything to do with the understanding that Dante Salvatore always knew more than he revealed, always saw more than he acknowledged, always understood the patterns of the world with the precision of a man who had spent his entire life learning to predict where the next threat would emerge. "Alessandra," he said, and my name on his lips felt like coming home and walking into a trap simultaneously. His voice, that low rumble of controlled power that had once whispered promises against my skin, and now fell between us like a judge's gavel. He made no move to let me in, simply stood there in the doorway, with one hand resting against the frame, his posture casual, but his eyes cataloging every injury, every tear in my clothing, every sign of the violence that had driven me back to him. And I knew with the certainty of a woman who had once known this man more intimately than she knew herself, that he was calculating, assessing, determining whether I was worth the trouble of saving, or if I should be left to the wolves I had foolishly thought I could run with. "Please," I whispered, and I hated how small my voice sounded, how broken and desperate, how far I had fallen from the woman who had walked away from him, with my head held high and my conviction wrapped around me like armor. "Can I start over?" The question hung in the air between us, weighted with 3 years of silence and regret, heavy with the admission that I had been wrong about so many things, loaded with the kind of vulnerability that I had sworn I would never show him again. I watched his jaw tighten, watched the muscle tick beneath that scar on his cheek, watched something flicker in those dark eyes that might have been satisfaction, or might have been pain, or might have been that dangerous combination of both that had always made him so impossible to read, so devastatingly effective at the games of power he played. He studied me for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. And in that time I felt the weight of every choice I had made since leaving him, felt the ghost of the woman I had been in his world pressing against the shell of who I had tried to become, felt the terrible truth settling into my bones that some women are marked by the men they love and no amount of distance or time or denial can wash away that claim. Behind him, I could see the interior of the penthouse, barely changed from my memories. All dark wood and leather, expensive art on the walls that had been acquired through methods I had never wanted to examine too closely. Floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city he controlled, with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove. It looked like a sanctuary and a prison, a palace and a tomb, and I wanted nothing more than to step across that threshold and surrender to whatever fate he decided I deserved. "You can start over, Alessandra," he finally said, and his words were a razor wrapped in velvet, soft and cutting in the same breath, delivering hope and threat with the same measured tone. "But this time, you'll finish what you started." He stepped aside, a gesture that was somehow both welcoming and ominous, an invitation that felt like a contract written in invisible ink. And I walked past him into the warmth of the penthouse, feeling his presence at my back like a brand, like a promise, like a threat I had been running from for 3 years and had finally stopped trying to escape. The door closed behind us with a soft click that sounded like a cell door locking, and I stood in the marble foyer dripping rainwater and blood onto his expensive Italian tile, my body shaking from cold and shock and the overwhelming relief of being somewhere that Marcus Chen's men could not reach me. Marcus, my second husband, my terrible mistake. The man I had married thinking I could have a normal life with a businessman who wore expensive suits and smiled for charity photographers, and turned out to be something so much worse than the honest monster I had left behind. I had discovered 3 hours ago that Marcus was not a legitimate import-export businessman, but a lieutenant in the triad, had witnessed him put a bullet in his accountant's head for skimming money, had seen the mask slip away to reveal the kind of cruelty that Dante had never pretended he didn't possess. At least Dante had always been honest about what he was, had never lied about the blood on his hands or the violence that came with his crown, had never asked me to pretend that his world was anything other than exactly what it appeared to be. "You're bleeding," Dante observed, his voice devoid of emotion as he moved past me toward the bar, and I could not tell if this was concern or simply a statement of fact, could not read whether he cared that I was hurt or simply wanted to assess the extent of the damage. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a crystal glass and brought it to me, pressing it into my shaking hands with a firmness that steadied me, his fingers brushing against mine in a contact that sent electricity racing up my arm, despite everything, despite the years and the betrayal and the distance I had put between us. "Drink," he commanded, and I obeyed because obeying Dante Salvatore had always been easier than fighting him, had always felt like surrender and victory simultaneously, had always made me feel simultaneously powerless and protected in ways that had terrified me when I was younger, and understood myself less. I drank, feeling the whiskey burn down my throat and settle in my stomach with a warmth that helped chase away some of the chill. And I watched as Dante pulled out his phone and made a call with the kind of efficiency that spoke of a man who was used to handling crises at all hours. "Luca, we have a situation," he said into the phone, his eyes never leaving my face as he spoke. "I need a full sweep of the building perimeter, and I need to know who followed Alessandra here because she did not arrive alone, and I need that information in the next 10 minutes. He hung up without waiting for a response because men like Dante Salvatore did not need confirmation that their orders would be followed. They simply expected obedience, and received it as their due. "How did you know I was followed?" I asked, my voice steadier now thanks to the whiskey and the growing realization that I was safe here, that whatever else Dante might be, he would not let Marcus's men touch me, would protect me with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to everything in his empire. "Because you came here," he said simply, moving to pour himself a drink, his movements precise and controlled in that way he had that always made me think of predators, of creatures who knew exactly how much power they possessed and exactly when to unleash it. Because the Alessandra I knew would have died before crawling back to me unless there was literally no other option, which means you are being hunted by someone you cannot handle alone, which means they are either very good or very connected or both, which means they followed you here thinking this building would be an easy target because they do not know who owns it. He turned back to me, leaning against the bar with his whiskey in hand, looking like every fantasy and nightmare I had spent 3 years trying to exorcise from my memory. You married Marcus Chen, he continued, and it was not a question but a statement. Proof that he had kept tabs on me despite the divorce papers and the silence and my attempt to disappear into a normal life. The same Marcus Chen, who has been trying to expand triad operations into my territory for the past 18 months. The same Marcus Chen who somehow managed to marry my ex-wife without anyone in my organization noticing the connection until now. The realization hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs and making the room spin around me in a dizzying kaleidoscope of understanding and horror. Marcus had not found me by chance, had not fallen in love with me organically. He had targeted me specifically because I had once been Dante's wife, had used me as an unwitting bridge to information about the Salvatore family operations, had married me as part of a long game I had been too naive and too desperate for normalcy to see. "Oh God," I whispered, the glass slipping from my nerveless fingers to shatter on the marble floor in an explosion of crystal shards that mirrored the shattering of every illusion I had built over the past 3 years. Dante was there before the glass finished breaking, his hands on my arms, steadying me with a grip that was firm without being painful, close enough that I could smell his cologne, that same dark, spicy scent that used to cling to my skin after nights in his bed, that used to make me feel claimed and owned in ways that both thrilled and terrified me. "Breathe, Alessandra," he commanded, and I obeyed because my body still responded to his voice with the muscle memory of our years together, still recognized him as the authority, even when my mind insisted I should be past such submission. "You did not know," he continued, and there was something almost gentle in his tone, almost kind, though Dante Salvatore was not a kind man, and we both knew it. "You were a pawn in his game, which makes you a victim of his ambition. But it also makes you valuable because you have been inside his operation for 2 years, and you have seen things he did not want you to see. Which is why he is hunting you now. Which is why you came to me." I looked up at him. This man I had loved and left, this beautiful monster who had never pretended to be anything other than exactly what he was, and I saw my future written in his eyes, a future that involved violence and vengeance, blood and retribution, the kind of justice that came from the barrel of a gun rather than a judge's bench. "What happens now?" I asked, though I already knew the answer, could already see the chess pieces moving in his mind, could already feel the web of his strategy beginning to weave itself around me, trapping me in threads of silk and steel. "Now," Dante said, releasing my arms but not stepping back, keeping me caged in the space between his body and the bar, dominating my senses with his presence in that way. He had always dominated every room he entered. "You tell me everything you know about Marcus Chen's operations, and then I decide whether keeping you alive is worth the war it will cost me." His hand came up to cup my chin, tilting my face up to meet his gaze, and his thumb brushed across my split lip, with a gentleness that contradicted the hardness in his eyes. "And then, Alessandra, you and I are going to have a very long conversation about why you really left, because I know it was not just about the violence. You were made for this world in ways you refused to accept, born for the darkness you kept trying to run toward the light, and I think it is time you stopped lying to yourself about who you really are." Before I could respond, before I could process the truth in his words that cut deeper than any accusation, the sound of gunfire erupted from somewhere below us, muffled by distance and concrete but unmistakable in its deadly percussion, and Dante's entire demeanor shifted from the man having a conversation with his ex-wife to the Mafia boss protecting his territory. He moved with lethal grace, pulling a gun from somewhere I had not seen it concealed and positioning himself between me and the door, his body a shield, his presence a fortress. And in that moment I understood with devastating clarity that I had never been safer than I was right now, in the eye of the hurricane, protected by the most dangerous man I had ever known. "Stay behind me," he ordered, and I did, pressing myself against his back and feeling the solid reality of him, the warm living proof that some men were born to be shields and swords simultaneously. And as we heard the elevator ding and the doors slide open with Luca's voice calling out that the triad soldiers who had followed me were eliminated and the building was secure, I realized that starting over with Dante Salvatore was not going to be about forgiveness or second chances. It was going to be about finally accepting the woman I was always meant to be, the queen who belonged beside this king. And that terrified me almost as much as it thrilled me because I had spent 3 years running from this truth, and now I was about to walk straight into it with my eyes wide open. The first rule Dante laid down came while I was still standing in his bathroom at 3 a.m, watching him clean the blood from my face with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the gun he had placed on the marble counter within easy reach, his movements methodical and practiced in a way that spoke of too many nights spent tending to wounds that should never have existed in the first place. "You do not leave this penthouse without my explicit permission, and without at least 2 of my men accompanying you wherever you go. And I do not care if you need to buy tampons or get your nails done or attend a fucking yoga class. You go nowhere alone. You trust no one outside of the people I designate as safe. And you accept that your freedom is the price you pay for breathing," he said, his dark eyes meeting mine in the mirror as he dabbed antiseptic on my split lip with a cotton swab. The sting of it. Nothing compared to the sting of realizing that I had traded one cage for another, except this time I had walked into it willingly, with my eyes wide open and my survival instinct overriding my pride. I wanted to argue, wanted to summon the independent woman I had tried so hard to become over the past 3 years. Wanted to tell him that I was not his property to command and control. But the words died in my throat because we both knew the truth. I had forfeited my right to independence the moment I showed up on his doorstep begging for sanctuary, had surrendered my autonomy when I chose his protection over my pride, had accepted the terms of this bargain before he even spoke them aloud, because women who run to Mafia bosses for salvation do not get to dictate the conditions of their rescue. "I understand," I whispered instead, watching his reflection as he moved to clean the scrape on my shoulder where Marcus's men had grabbed me, their fingers digging in hard enough to leave bruises that were already blooming purple and yellow across my pale skin. And I saw something flicker across Dante's face. Rage, possession, that dangerous combination of both that I remembered from our marriage. The look that said he was cataloging every mark on my body and mentally adding them to a ledger of debts that would be paid in blood. The second rule came an hour later when I was wrapped in one of his shirts because my dress was ruined beyond salvation, and all of my clothes were still at the apartment I had shared with Marcus, the apartment I could never return to without signing my own death warrant. "You will attend all family functions as my wife, not my ex-wife, and you will play the role convincingly enough that no one questions whether our reconciliation is genuine or strategic, because perception is reality in this world, and I need everyone to believe that you are under my protection not out of charity, but out of ownership," Dante informed me, as he poured us both another drink. This one cognac from a bottle that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. His words delivered with the same casual authority he might use to order dinner or discuss the weather, as if he were not fundamentally rewriting the terms of my existence with every pronouncement. I took the glass he offered me and settled into the leather armchair across from where he stood by the windows, the city sprawling out behind him like a kingdom he ruled from his tower. And I felt the weight of what he was asking, no, demanding, settle over me like a cloak that was simultaneously suffocating and strangely comforting. "You want me to pretend we are back together?" I said slowly, trying to understand the full implications of this requirement, trying to see all the angles the way Dante always did, always 3 moves ahead of everyone else in the game. "You want your family and your enemies to believe that we have reconciled, that I am yours again in every way that matters. I do not want you to pretend anything, Alessandra," he corrected, moving away from the windows to sit in the chair opposite mine, his long legs stretched out in front of him in a posture that should have been relaxed, but somehow still radiated that coiled tension he always carried, that sense of a predator at rest who could spring into lethal action at a moment's notice. I want you to be my wife again in truth, not just in appearance, because half measures will get you killed in this world, and I did not eliminate 3 triad soldiers in my lobby tonight just to watch you die, because you could not commit fully to the protection I am offering. He swirled the cognac in his glass, watching the amber liquid catch the light. And when he looked up at me again, his eyes held that intensity that used to make my knees weak, that focus that made me feel like I was the only thing in the world that mattered to him, even when I knew he had 100 other concerns demanding his attention. The third rule is honesty, complete and uncompromising honesty about everything. Your marriage to Marcus, why you really left me, what you have done in the 3 years we have been apart, what you want from this arrangement beyond mere survival, because I will not play games with you, will not tolerate lies or omissions, will not accept anything less than the full truth even when it hurts us both. The demand for honesty hung between us like a challenge, like a gauntlet thrown down that I could either pick up or walk away from, except we both knew I could not walk away, because there was nowhere left to run, and no one else who could protect me from the consequences of my choices. You want the truth? I asked, hearing the bitterness creep into my voice despite my best efforts to sound neutral, feeling 3 years of buried emotions rising up like a tide I could no longer hold back. You want to know why I left you? Why I ran from the best thing that ever happened to me? Why I threw away our marriage and our life together to go chase a fantasy of normalcy that never existed? I stood up, unable to sit still while this confession poured out of me, unable to remain composed while I finally spoke the words I had been carrying, like stones in my chest, for 3 years. I left because I was pregnant, Dante. Because I found out I was carrying your child 2 days before I watched you torture that traitor in our basement, watched you take him apart piece by piece while he screamed for mercy you would never give, and I realized that I was terrified, not of you, but of myself, of how much I wanted to stay and watch, of how the violence did not repel me the way it should have, of how I was afraid I would raise our child to think that what we had was normal and healthy when I knew it was neither of those things. The silence that followed my confession was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears, could hear the rain still falling against the windows, could hear Dante's breathing change as he processed what I had just revealed to him. He stood slowly, setting his glass down with such careful control that I knew he was restraining himself from throwing it, from letting the rage I could see building in his eyes explode into something destructive. And when he spoke, his voice was so low and dangerous that it raised goosebumps on my skin despite the warmth of the penthouse. You were pregnant, he repeated, each word precisely enunciated as if he were testing the weight of them, trying to understand how this piece of information fit into the puzzle of our past. You were carrying my child, and you left without telling me, made that decision alone, took away my right to be a father before I even knew I might become one. I miscarried 6 weeks after I left, I continued, the words tumbling out now that I had started this confession, now that the dam had broken and there was no point in holding anything back. I was alone in a hotel room in Boston, bleeding and terrified, and I had no one to call because I had cut myself off from everyone in your world, and I had not yet built a life anywhere else, and I lost your baby without you ever knowing it existed. Tears were streaming down my face now, hot and bitter and 3 years overdue, washing away the careful facade I had maintained throughout our divorce, throughout my marriage to Marcus, throughout every moment I had spent pretending I had made the right choice when I knew in my bones that I had made the worst mistake of my life. I left because I was a coward, because I convinced myself that running away was protecting our child from your world, when really I was just protecting myself from having to confront the truth about who I really am, about how much I loved the power and the danger and the thrill of being your queen, even when it terrified me. Dante crossed the space between us in 3 strides, and his hands were in my hair, tilting my face up to meet his gaze, and I could see the devastation in his eyes, the pain that my confession had carved into him, the rage that was directed not at me but at the circumstances that had stolen something precious from both of us before we even knew we had it. "I would have let you go," he said, his voice rough with emotion that he rarely allowed anyone to see. Emotion that I had only glimpsed in the most private moments of our marriage when his walls came down and he allowed me to see the man beneath the monster. "If you had told me you were pregnant and that you were afraid, if you had trusted me enough to have that conversation, I would have found a way to give you the life you wanted, would have stepped back from parts of my empire, would have built you a fortress where you could raise our child in safety, even if it meant weakening my position." His thumbs wiped away my tears with a tenderness that broke something inside me, some last defense I had been maintaining against him, against this, against the truth I had been running from. "But you did not give me that choice, did not trust me with the truth, made the decision for both of us, and robbed us both of something we can never get back." "I know," I whispered, my hands coming up to grip his wrists, needing to hold on to something solid while my world realigned itself around this conversation. Around these truths, we were finally speaking after 3 years of silence and separation. "I know I was wrong. I know I should have trusted you. I know I made the worst decision I could have made, and I have lived with that regret every single day since." I took a shuddering breath, forcing myself to meet his eyes, to let him see all of me. The grief, the shame, the desperate hope that maybe we could find some way forward from this wreckage. But I cannot change the past, cannot unmake the choices I made or bring back what we lost. Can only tell you the truth now and hope that it is enough, that you can forgive me even if I can never forgive myself. He pulled me against his chest, his arms coming around me with a fierceness that spoke of possession and protection in equal measure, and I buried my face in his shirt and let myself cry for everything we had lost. The child who never was. The marriage I had destroyed. The 3 years we had spent apart when we could have been finding our way through the darkness together. We stood like that for a long time, holding each other while the city sprawled out beyond the windows, and the rain continued its relentless assault on the glass. And I felt something shift between us. Some understanding being reached without words. Some foundation being laid for whatever came next, because we had finally spoken the truths that had been festering between us like infected wounds. When I finally pulled back, exhausted from crying and confession, Dante kept one arm around my waist, anchoring me to him, as if he were afraid I might disappear again if he let go completely. "Luca warned me that you have changed since I left," I said, remembering the brief conversation I had overheard while Dante was on the phone, the concern in his second-in-command's voice when he mentioned his boss. "He said you became colder, more ruthless, that you have been building your empire with nothing to lose." "Luca talks too much," Dante replied, but there was no real heat in the words, just a tired acknowledgement of truth. "But he is not wrong. When you left, you took something from me that I had not realized I possessed until it was gone. Some capacity for mercy or restraint that I had maintained because I thought I needed to be a certain kind of man for you." He guided me back to the chairs, settling me into mine before retrieving our abandoned drinks, and I watched him move with that predatory grace I had always found mesmerizing, that lethal elegance that marked him as dangerous even when he was doing something as mundane as serving cognac. Without that anchor, without you as my reason to maintain some semblance of humanity, I stopped pretending to be anything other than what I am, a monster who rules through fear and violence, a king who takes what he wants and destroys anyone who stands in his way, a man who has built an empire on the bones of his enemies and will continue to do so until someone finally manages to put a bullet in my head. The casual way he spoke about his own death chilled me, reminded me that this world we inhabited was not some romantic fantasy but a brutal reality where men like Dante lived fast and died young and left behind legacies written in blood. And now I am back, I said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn as I saw the trap I had walked into, the role he was going to require me to play in whatever came next. Now I am here as a reminder of whatever humanity you used to possess, as an anchor to keep you from becoming completely lost in the darkness, as a reason to maintain some restraint, even when everything in you wants to burn the world down. Now you are here as my wife, he corrected, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that made my breath catch, made my pulse quicken with that familiar mixture of fear and arousal that he had always inspired in me. Now you are here as my equal and my partner, as the woman who will stand beside me and help me navigate the war that is coming, because Marcus Chen made a critical mistake when he targeted you. He gave me a personal stake in destroying him, gave me a reason beyond territory and pride to dismantle his entire operation piece by piece. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his focus entirely on me in a way that made the rest of the world disappear. And you are going to help me do it, Alessandra, because you have been inside his organization for 2 years, because you know his routines and his contacts and his weaknesses, because you are the key to taking him apart in ways he will never see coming. Before I could respond, before I could process the full implications of what he was proposing, an explosion rocked the building with enough force to rattle the windows and send us both to our feet. And through the glass, I could see flames erupting from one of Dante's warehouses 3 blocks away, orange and red against the night sky like a beacon announcing that the war Marcus had started by hunting me was about to escalate into something far bigger and bloodier than either of us had anticipated. Dante was already on his phone, barking orders in Italian to someone on the other end, his face a mask of cold fury that promised retribution and violence. And I stood there watching the flames climb higher into the rain-soaked sky, and realized with a clarity that was both terrifying and exhilarating that I was no longer running from this life. I was about to dive into it head first, about to embrace the darkness I had spent 3 years denying, about to become the queen this king needed beside him, even if it meant accepting that the woman I had tried to become was never real, and the woman I had always been was finally ready to claim her crown. As Dante turned back to me with murder in his eyes, and something that might have been pride in the set of his mouth, as he reached out his hand to me in an invitation and a challenge and a promise all rolled into one gesture, I understood that the price of his protection was not just my freedom or my honesty, but my complete surrender to the truth about who I was meant to be. And the only question left was whether I was brave enough, or broken enough, or desperate enough to pay it. To take his hand and let him pull me into the inferno that our reunion had ignited. To stop fighting against my nature and finally accept that some women were born to be darkness rather than light. And I was about to find out which category I truly belonged to as the city burned around us. And the man I had never stopped loving looked at me like I was both his salvation and his damnation wrapped in the same beautiful, terrible package. Living in close quarters with Dante Salvatore after 3 years of separation was like trying to remember how to breathe underwater. Familiar in some deep, instinctive way that my body recognized even when my mind insisted it should feel foreign. Suffocating in its intensity, yet somehow necessary for survival. And filled with moments of such visceral intimacy that I found myself questioning whether I had ever truly left at all, or if I had simply been holding my breath for 3 years, waiting to surface back into the life I was always meant to live. The days following the warehouse explosion fell into a rhythm that was both comforting and claustrophobic, with Dante working from the penthouse to coordinate his response to Marcus's escalating attacks, while I existed in a strange limbo of being his wife, without actually being his wife, wearing his clothes because mine were still inaccessible, eating meals he had prepared or ordered because leaving the building was too dangerous, falling asleep on the couch during his late-night strategy sessions only to wake up in his bed with no memory of being carried there, my body remembering the sanctuary of his arms, even when my conscious mind insisted on maintaining some semblance of distance and self-preservation. It was during one of these late-night sessions, nearly a week after my desperate arrival on his doorstep, that the walls between us finally crumbled completely in a way that felt both inevitable and earth-shattering, transforming the careful detente we had maintained into something rawer and more honest, and infinitely more dangerous than the polite distance we had been trying to preserve. I had been dozing in the armchair while Dante worked at his desk, reviewing reports from his various operations and making calls in that mixture of English and Italian he used when conducting business, his voice a low rumble that had become the soundtrack to my new existence. When I heard him end a call with more force than usual, the sharp click of his phone hitting the desktop, pulling me fully awake to find him staring at me with an expression I could not quite decipher, something between fury and anguish, accusation and understanding. The look of a man who had just received information that confirmed his worst suspicions while simultaneously breaking something inside him he had thought was already thoroughly shattered. "What is it?" I asked, sitting up straighter in the chair, my heart beginning to pound with a dread I could not name but could feel settling over me like a shroud. The kind of premonition that comes from knowing someone well enough to read their body language even across a room, even after years apart, even when they are trying desperately to maintain their composure in the face of whatever storm is building behind their eyes. "What did you find out?" Dante stood from his desk with a controlled precision that spoke of rage being held in check by sheer force of will, moving to the bar to pour himself a drink with hands that were not quite steady. And I watched as he downed the whiskey in one swallow before pouring another, his movements economical but carrying an edge of violence barely restrained. "Marcus Chen did not marry you by accident or coincidence," he said finally, his back still to me as he stared at the bottles lined up on the bar, as if they held answers to questions he did not want to ask. "He targeted you specifically, deliberately, with full knowledge of who you were and who you had been married to. And he spent 2 years using you as an unwitting source of information about my operations, my family, my weaknesses." He turned then, and the look on his face made my blood run cold because I had seen Dante angry before, had seen him furious and violent and deadly. But I had never seen him look quite like this, betrayed not by me but on my behalf, devastated by the realization of how thoroughly I had been manipulated, murderous with a rage that had nowhere to go except inward, because the person he wanted to protect had already been harmed in ways he could not undo. The words hit me like physical blows, each one landing with the force of a revelation that recontextualized every moment of my marriage to Marcus, every conversation we had shared, every time he had asked me seemingly innocent questions about my past or my family or the world I had come from before I met him. And I felt the room tilt around me as understanding crashed through my carefully constructed narrative about having escaped Dante's world into something cleaner and safer and more normal. "No," I whispered, but it was a denial without conviction, because the pieces were already falling into place with sickening clarity. The way Marcus had seemed to find me by chance at a gallery opening, but had somehow known exactly what to say to catch my interest. The way he had been patient with my reluctance to discuss my past while subtly steering conversations back to my ex-husband and his business. The way he had always been so understanding about my aversion to violence while quietly pumping me for information about how Dante operated, what his codes were, who his allies were, where his vulnerabilities might lie. "Yes," Dante said, crossing the space between us to crouch in front of my chair, his hands gripping the armrests on either side of me, caging me in with his presence but not touching me, giving me space to process while making it impossible for me to look anywhere except at him, at the truth written in his dark eyes and the hard line of his mouth. "My investigators finally cracked the full extent of his operation tonight, traced the connections between the triad and several attempts on my family over the past 2 years, attempts that had inside information about our movements and our security protocols, information that could have only come from someone who had intimate knowledge of how we operate." His voice was gentle despite the brutality of what he was telling me, careful in a way that suggested he knew exactly how fragile I was in this moment, how close to shattering completely. "You were not just a trophy wife or a distraction or even a source of information about past operations. You were an active intelligence asset, feeding him data every time you mentioned something from our marriage, every time you compared his business practices to what you remembered of mine, every time you let slip some detail about family dynamics or organizational structure that you thought was harmless reminiscence but was actually strategic intelligence. I felt like I was going to be sick, felt the bile rising in my throat as I understood the full scope of my naivety, my stupidity, my willingness to believe that someone could love me for who I was, rather than for what I represented or what I could provide access to. And the worst part was that I could not even claim complete ignorance because there had been moments, small moments I had dismissed or rationalized, when something had felt off about Marcus's interest in my past, when his questions had seemed just a little too specific, or his timing just a little too convenient. He used me, I said, and my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears, emptied of everything except the dawning horror of recognizing myself as a pawn in a game I had not even known I was playing. I thought I was escaping your world and building a normal life, and instead I walked straight into a trap, let myself be manipulated and exploited, became a weapon pointed at the one person I should have been protecting instead of running from. You were a victim of his manipulation, Dante corrected, and one of his hands finally left the armrest to cut my face, his thumb brushing across my cheekbone with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the fury I could feel radiating from him in waves. You made choices based on incomplete information and a desire for safety that any person would understand, and he exploited your vulnerability and your guilt and your desperate need to believe you could have a life outside of the darkness, and that makes him a predator and you his prey, not his accomplice. His eyes searched mine, demanding that I hear him, that I accept this absolution even if I could not quite believe it myself. But it also means he has been building a case against my family for 2 years, has been gathering intelligence and making connections and preparing for an all-out war. And the only reason he wants you dead now is because you witnessed him commit murder, and he knows that you are the one piece of evidence that could tie him directly to crimes he has been trying to keep separate from his public persona. The implications of what he was saying washed over me in successive waves, each one carrying new layers of understanding about why Marcus had reacted so violently to my accidental witness of his crime, why he could not simply let me disappear or divorce him quietly, why he was willing to risk open conflict with Dante's organization, rather than cutting his losses and moving on to some other strategy. I am not just a liability to him, I said slowly, working through the logic even as my mind reeled from the emotional impact of these revelations. I am the thread that could unravel his entire operation if I testify, if I go to authorities, or even just to your family with what I know about his business dealings and his connections and his true nature beneath the businessman facade. You are the key to bringing down his entire empire, Dante agreed, standing and pulling me to my feet with him, his hands on my shoulders now, grounding me with his touch, keeping me anchored when everything else felt like it was spinning out of control. Which is why he will not stop hunting you, why he escalated to bombing my warehouse when he realized you had come to me for protection, why this situation is going to get much worse before it gets better. He paused, his jaw tightening as if he were weighing his next words carefully, deciding how much truth I could handle in this moment when I was already drowning in revelations. And it is also why I am going to ask you to do something that goes against every instinct I have to keep you safe and away from danger. I am going to ask you to help me destroy him, to use what you know about his operations to guide my strategy, to be an active participant in this war, rather than just a protected asset I keep locked away in this tower. The request hung in the air between us, and I could see the conflict in his eyes, the way it cost him to ask this of me when his every instinct was to shelter and guard and control, to keep me far from anything that might hurt me after I had already been hurt so badly by his world and by my own choices. You want me to be bait, I said, not as a question but as an understanding, seeing the shape of what he was proposing even though he had not said it explicitly. You want to use me to draw him out, to make him careless and desperate, to turn his obsession with silencing me into the weapon that destroys him. I want you to be my partner, Dante corrected, his hands sliding down my arms to capture my hands in his grip firm and warm and surprisingly steady, given the magnitude of what we were discussing. I want you to stand beside me as my equal, using your intelligence and your knowledge and your understanding of Marcus to help me dismantle his operation piece by piece. And yes, that might involve putting you in situations that scare me, that make me question my own judgment, that force me to balance my need to protect you against the tactical advantages your involvement provides. He pulled me closer, eliminating the last bit of distance between us, and I could feel the heat of his body, could smell his cologne mixed with the whiskey he had been drinking, could see the war being waged behind his eyes between the man who loved me and the strategist who saw me as a crucial asset in the coming battle. But I also want you to know that this is your choice, that I will not force you into danger if you are not willing, that you can say no and I will find another way to handle Marcus even if it takes longer and costs more lives and puts my entire organization at greater risk. The fact that he was offering me a choice, that he was respecting my agency even when he so clearly wanted to simply command and control as was his nature, meant more to me than he could possibly understand. And I found myself looking up at this man who had been my husband, who I had left and betrayed and run from, who I had convinced myself was too dangerous and too dark and too violent for me to love safely. And I saw him clearly for perhaps the first time, not as a monster or a savior, but as a man doing his best to navigate impossible situations with the tools he had been given by birth and circumstance and choice. A man who was capable of tenderness and brutality in equal measure. A man who loved me enough to let me choose even when it terrified him. "I will help you," I said, my voice stronger than I expected, steadier than I felt, carrying a conviction that came from somewhere deep inside me that had been waiting 3 years to be acknowledged. "I will be your partner in this, will use what I know to destroy the man who used me, will stand beside you and face whatever comes, because I am done running from who I am, done pretending I can be someone softer and safer, when the truth is that I was made for this darkness, born to be your queen in ways I was too afraid to accept before." The words were barely out of my mouth before Dante was kissing me, his hands tangling in my hair, his mouth claiming mine with a desperation that spoke of 3 years of separation and longing and the painful joy of reunion. And I kissed him back with equal fervor, my body remembering his with the ease of muscle memory, my hands finding their way under his shirt to trace the familiar landscape of muscle and scar tissue, feeling the proof of his humanity beneath the monster everyone else saw. We stumbled backward until my back hit the wall, his body pinning me there with a delicious pressure that made me gasp against his mouth, and somewhere in the distance I could hear his phone ringing. But neither of us cared, because this moment was 3 years overdue. This connection was what we both needed more than air or strategy, or the endless chess game of Mafia politics that governed our existence. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, both flushed with desire and emotion, and the overwhelming relief of finally giving in to what we had been circling around since the moment I appeared on his doorstep. Dante rested his forehead against mine, and I could feel him trembling with the effort of restraint, of not taking this further when there was still so much unresolved between us, still so much we needed to say and work through before we could truly be together again. "I never stopped loving you," he whispered, the confession raw and honest and completely at odds with the controlled facade he showed the rest of the world. "I never stopped wanting you, never stopped hoping you would come back even when I convinced myself I hated you for leaving. Never stopped seeing your face in every room I entered and finding it empty without you there." "I never stopped loving you either," I admitted, my own voice breaking on the words, thick with tears I had not realized I was crying until I felt them hot on my cheeks. "I tried so hard to forget you, to build a life where you did not exist, to convince myself I had made the right choice, but you were always there in the back of my mind, a ghost I could not exorcise, a standard against which every other man fell short, a truth I kept running from because accepting it meant accepting all the parts of myself I was trying to deny." I pulled back just enough to look him in the eyes, needing him to see the truth of what I was saying. needing him to understand that this was not just passion or desperation or the adrenaline of danger, but something deeper and more permanent and infinitely more terrifying. I love you, Dante Salvatore. I love your darkness and your violence and your brutal honesty. I love the way you make me feel powerful and protected simultaneously. I love that you see me as your equal even when the rest of the world would see me as your possession. And I am done fighting against that truth. Done pretending I can be anything other than your wife in every way that matters. His phone rang again, persistent and demanding. And this time he answered it with obvious reluctance, his eyes never leaving mine as he listened to whoever was on the other end, with growing tension evident in every line of his body. When? He asked sharply, and then after a pause, how many casualties? Another pause, longer this time, and I watched his expression shift from concern to cold fury to something that looked almost like anticipation. Good. Let him think he is winning. Let him believe his strategy is working, and then we spring the trap exactly as we discussed. He ended the call and looked at me with an intensity that made my breath catch, made my heart race with equal parts fear and excitement. Marcus just hit another one of my operations, a shipping container full of weapons that he thinks will cripple my ability to respond to his aggression, he said, his voice carrying that particular quality it got when he was working through strategy in real time, when he was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. But what he does not know is that I wanted him to hit that shipment, that I let intelligence about its location slip through channels I knew he had compromised, that the weapons in that container were obsolete surplus I was planning to dispose of anyway, and that by hitting it, he has just confirmed exactly which of my people are feeding him information, which means I now know precisely how deep his infiltration goes, and can begin systematically cutting out the rot from my organization. I stared at him, understanding dawning as I saw the full scope of the game he was playing, the layers of deception and counterintelligence that he had been orchestrating even while seeming to react defensively to Marcus's attacks, and I realized with a mixture of awe and recognition that this was the man I had married. This brilliant, ruthless strategist who could turn apparent losses into victories, who could sacrifice pieces on the board to position himself for checkmate, who could see patterns and possibilities that no one else could perceive until it was too late to counter them. You have been letting him think he is winning, I said slowly, piecing together the implications of what he had just revealed. You have been using me as the catalyst to draw him out, to make him overconfident and sloppy, to get him to reveal the full extent of his operation and his network so you could map it all before you struck back. I have been preparing the battlefield, Dante agreed, pulling me away from the wall and leading me to the couch, settling us both down with his arm around my shoulders, holding me close as if he needed the physical contact to ground himself in what was coming next. And now that I know who I can trust and who needs to be eliminated, now that I have Marcus's complete network mapped and his resources stretched thin across multiple fronts he thinks he is winning, now that I have you here safe and willing to help me instead of running from me, I am ready to move from defense to offense, to take this war to him in ways he will never see coming until it is far too late to save himself. He turned to face me more fully, his hand coming up to cup my face with that gentleness that always surprised me given how lethal those same hands could be. But I need you to understand what you are agreeing to. Need you to know that once we start this, there is no going back, no changing your mind halfway through, no walking away if it gets too intense or too violent or too morally complicated, because we are going to destroy Marcus Chen and everyone connected to him, and that destruction is going to be thorough and brutal and absolutely final, and you are going to be part of it whether you pull triggers yourself or simply provide the intelligence that guides my hand. And I need to know that you can live with that, can accept that level of complicity and participation without it breaking something essential inside you the way watching me torture that traitor broke something 3 years ago. The question was fair, the concern legitimate, and I took a moment to really examine myself, to look honestly at the woman I had become over 3 years of running and denying and trying to be something I was not. and I found that the horror I expected to feel at the prospect of helping destroy another human being, even one who had used and betrayed me, was absent, replaced by a cold clarity that felt more honest than anything I had experienced since leaving Dante, a recognition that some people forfeit their right to mercy when they choose to be predators, that Marcus had made his choices knowing the consequences, and now would face them, and that my role in his downfall was not something to feel guilty about, but something to embrace as my right as his victim and Dante's partner. "I can live with it," I told him, meaning it with every fiber of my being, feeling the last piece of the woman I had tried to become, falling away, to reveal the woman I had always been underneath. "I can more than live with it. I want to be part of bringing him down, want to watch him lose everything he built on lies and manipulation and the pain of others, want him to know in his final moments that I was the key to his destruction, that the woman he thought he could use and discard became the architect of his downfall. And I want to do this standing beside you as your equal, and your partner, and your wife in every way that matters." Dante's smile was sharp and dangerous, and filled with a pride that made my heart soar, even as I recognized how far I had fallen, or perhaps how high I had risen into the darkness that was my true home. And as he pulled me into another kiss that tasted of promises and violence and the sweetest kind of vengeance, as his hands began mapping my body with the possessive certainty of a man reclaiming what had always been his, I felt the last chains of my old life, my old self, my old illusions falling away like scales from my eyes, and I knew with absolute certainty that there was no going back from this moment, that I had finally accepted my crown as his Queen of Darkness, and that together we were going to set the world on fire and watch Marcus Chen burn in the flames we created. And the only question remaining was not whether I could live with the violence and the brutality and the moral complexity of what was coming, but whether I was ready to discover just how much I was capable of enjoying it, how deeply the darkness ran in my own veins, how completely I could embrace the monster that had been waiting inside me all along for permission to emerge. And as Dante's phone began ringing again, with what I knew would be the next phase of his carefully orchestrated plan, as he pulled away from our kiss with obvious reluctance to answer it, while keeping me pressed against his side, as I heard him give orders that would set in motion events that could not be stopped or reversed, I realized that I was not just ready to face whatever came next. I was eager for it, hungry for the reckoning that Marcus had brought upon himself when he made the fatal mistake of thinking I was just another helpless victim he could exploit, rather than the dangerous woman I had been trained to be by the most dangerous man in New York. And that eagerness, that hunger, that willingness to become something darker and more deadly than I had ever allowed myself to be before, was perhaps the most honest thing about me, the truest expression of who Alessandra Salvatore had always been, beneath the layers of denial and fear, and the desperate, futile attempt to be someone softer and safer and less terrifying to contemplate in the mirror. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of strategic planning and careful orchestration that transformed me from a passive victim seeking sanctuary into an active participant in the dismantling of Marcus Chen's empire. And I discovered with each passing day that the woman I had tried so hard to suppress during my years away from Dante was not only still alive inside me but was thriving in this environment of danger and calculated violence, feeding on the adrenaline and the sense of purpose and the intoxicating power that came from wielding information as a weapon against the man who had tried to wield me as one against the only person I had ever truly loved. Dante recovered from the bullet wound he had taken at his cousin's wedding with the kind of stubborn resilience that seemed to define everything about him, refusing to show weakness even when I could see the pain etched in the lines around his eyes, even when I caught him gripping the edge of his desk a little too tightly during long strategy sessions, even when I found bloodstains on the bandages I changed for him late at night when the penthouse was quiet, and we could pretend for brief moments that we were just a man and a woman caring for each other, rather than two pieces on a chessboard, positioning themselves for the final, devastating moves of a war that had consumed everything around us. It was during one of these late-night bandage changes, nearly 4 weeks after my desperate arrival on his doorstep, that I finally voiced the proposal that had been taking shape in my mind ever since Dante had explained the full scope of Marcus's infiltration into his organization and the systematic way he had been using me to gather intelligence that could bring down the Salvatore family. "I want to be the bait," I said quietly, my fingers gentle on the healing wound in his shoulder, feeling the heat of his skin beneath my touch and the way his muscles tensed at my words, even though we both knew this conversation had been inevitable from the moment I agreed to be his partner in this war. "I want you to arrange for Marcus to find out that I am going to testify against him, that I have been working with federal prosecutors to build a case that will not only implicate him in murder, but will expose his entire triad operation and all the connections he has been so carefully cultivating over the past 5 years, and I want you to make it look like I am vulnerable, like there is a window of opportunity for him to eliminate me before I can do irreparable damage to everything he has built." Dante's hand shot up to catch my wrist, his grip tight enough to hurt, though I knew he was holding back the full force of what he wanted to do, which was probably to shake me or lock me away somewhere safe, or simply refuse to even consider putting me in that kind of danger, no matter how sound the tactical reasoning behind my proposal might be. "Absolutely not," he said, his voice low and dangerous, carrying that edge of command that usually made people scramble to obey without question. "I will not use you as bait, will not put you in a position where Marcus can get close enough to harm you, will not risk losing you again when I just got you back. And I do not care how much strategic sense it makes or how much it might accelerate our timeline for destroying him. The answer is no, and that is final, and we will find another way to draw him out that does not require you to paint a target on your back, and trust that I can reach you in time to prevent him from pulling the trigger." I had expected this resistance, had known that proposing myself as bait would trigger every protective instinct in Dante's considerable arsenal of instincts, and I had spent days preparing my argument, marshalling my logic, understanding that I would need to convince him not just with strategy but with emotion, not just with tactical advantages, but with the demonstration that I trusted him completely to keep me safe even in the most dangerous situation we could engineer. "Listen to me," I said, using my free hand to cup his face, forcing him to look at me instead of at the wall where he had been staring as if he could find some alternative written there in the shadows. "Marcus is getting desperate. His operations are failing one after another as you systematically dismantle everything he built. His allies are abandoning him as they realize he is losing this war, and desperate men make mistakes, take risks they would never consider when they are thinking clearly. And that desperation is what we need to exploit, because a desperate Marcus is a careless Marcus. And a careless Marcus is a Marcus we can eliminate permanently without worrying about retaliation or consequences, or the possibility that he will slip away and rebuild somewhere else beyond your reach." Dante closed his eyes, his jaw working as he fought against the logic of what I was saying, fought against his own understanding that I was right, even though everything in him wanted to reject the idea of putting me in harm's way. And when he finally opened his eyes again, they were filled with a combination of fury and resignation, and something that looked almost like pride that I had become strong enough, strategic enough, ruthless enough to propose this plan in the first place. "If I agree to this," he said slowly, each word carefully measured as if he were negotiating the terms of his own surrender to the inevitable, "then you follow my rules exactly. You wear the wire and the tracking devices I provide. You stay within the perimeter I establish. You trust my people to be in position before you expose yourself to any danger. And the moment, the absolute moment, I give the signal, you drop to the ground and you let my team handle Marcus and whoever he brings with him, because I will not watch you die, Alessandra. I will not survive losing you a second time. And if this plan goes wrong, I need to know that you gave me every possible advantage to save you before it is too late." "I trust you," I said simply. And I meant it with every fiber of my being. Meant it in a way I had never fully trusted him before, because trust requires not just faith in someone's intentions, but faith in their capabilities, and their judgment, and their willingness to do whatever is necessary to protect what matters to them. And I finally understood after 3 years away from him that Dante Salvatore was the most capable, most intelligent, most absolutely ruthless person I had ever known when it came to protecting the people he loved, and I was done questioning whether I deserved that protection, or whether accepting it made me weak or dependent or anything other than what I actually was, a woman strong enough to recognize that partnership means allowing yourself to be vulnerable with the one person who has earned the right to guard that vulnerability. The plan came together over the next week, with a precision that spoke to Dante's years of experience orchestrating operations that required split-second timing and absolute coordination among dozens of moving pieces. And I watched him work with a fascination that bordered on awe, seeing the way his mind moved through possibilities and contingencies, the way he anticipated problems before they arose and built redundancies into every system, the way he transformed what could have been a reckless gamble into something that looked almost like a certainty if executed perfectly. The trap was set for a Thursday evening at a warehouse on the waterfront that Dante's family used for legitimate shipping operations, a location that would seem vulnerable enough to tempt Marcus into taking the bait, while actually being a killing ground that Dante had prepared with the thoroughness of a master strategist who left nothing to chance. I was wired with enough surveillance equipment to transmit everything I said and did to Dante's command center 3 blocks away, tracked by GPS devices sewn into my clothing and hidden in my jewelry, surrounded by snipers positioned on every rooftop with clear lines of sight and tactical teams waiting in concealed positions within the warehouse itself. And yet, despite all these precautions, I could feel my heart pounding as I walked into that warehouse alone at exactly 8 p.m., knowing that Marcus was out there somewhere watching, knowing that the next hour would determine whether I lived or died, whether we succeeded in ending this war, or whether we had miscalculated his desperation and given him exactly the opportunity he needed to destroy us both. The warehouse was dimly lit and cavernous, filled with shipping containers and crates that created a maze of shadows and hiding places, and I walked toward the center of the space where a single light hung from the ceiling, illuminating a small circle that felt simultaneously like a stage and a sacrificial altar. And I positioned myself there exactly as Dante had instructed, visible and exposed, and apparently vulnerable, while knowing that I was actually standing in the most protected spot in the entire building. The one location where every weapon and every ally we had could converge if things went wrong. "Hello, Alessandra." Marcus's voice came from somewhere in the darkness, smooth and cultured, and carrying just the faintest edge of mockery. And I turned toward the sound, while keeping my body language open and non-threatening, playing the role of the frightened ex-wife, who had made a terrible mistake in thinking she could escape his reach. He emerged from behind a shipping container, with 3 of his men flanking him, all armed, all watchful, and I could see in his eyes that same cold calculation I had, once mistaken for intelligence and sophistication, but now recognized as the emptiness of a man who viewed people as tools to be used and discarded without sentiment or remorse. "I must admit, I am surprised you agreed to meet me alone," he continued, moving closer with the confidence of a predator who believes he has cornered his prey. "I thought your ex-husband would have taught you better than to take such foolish risks. But perhaps you are more desperate than I realized, more willing to bargain for your life than I gave you credit for. And that desperation is something I can work with. Something we can negotiate around if you are willing to be reasonable about what you know and what you are prepared to forget, in exchange for me allowing you to continue breathing." I let him talk. Let him move closer. Let him believe that he was in control of this situation, while I watched his bodyguards and tracked their positions, and waited for Dante's signal, feeling the weight of the wire against my skin, and the knowledge that everything Marcus said was being recorded, that every threat he made was digging his grave deeper, that he was giving us exactly what we needed to justify what was about to happen to him and everyone who had helped him try to destroy the man I loved. And when Marcus finally reached out to grab my arm with that possessive confidence that said he thought he had already won, when his fingers closed around my wrist and he pulled me closer with a smile that promised violence and domination, I heard Dante's voice in my earpiece saying a single word: "Now." And I dropped to the ground exactly as I had been instructed, while the world exploded into gunfire and movement and the systematic elimination of every threat in that warehouse with a precision that was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. And as I lay on the cold concrete with my hands over my head, listening to Marcus scream in rage and pain as Dante's men took him down, I felt something settle inside me that might have been satisfaction, or might have been the final acceptance of who I truly was. And when the shooting finally stopped, and Dante was there pulling me into his arms and checking me for injuries with hands that shook despite his attempts at control, I looked up at him and smiled because we had won. Because Marcus was captured and his operation was destroyed, and the war was finally over, and because I had proven to both of us that I was exactly the partner he needed, exactly the queen this king deserved, exactly the woman I had been running from for 3 years, and was finally ready to become without reservation or regret, or any lingering doubt about whether I belonged in this darkness that was our shared kingdom. I stood in Marcus Chen's now empty penthouse 3 days after his capture, surrounded by federal agents cataloging evidence and dismantling what remained of his carefully constructed double life. And I felt nothing. No sympathy for the man who had used me so thoroughly. No regret for the role I had played in his downfall. No residual attachment to the 2 years I had spent in this gilded cage, thinking I was building a normal life when I was actually just another piece of furniture in a museum of lies and manipulation. Dante stood beside me with his hand resting possessively on the small of my back, his presence a silent declaration of ownership and protection that I no longer felt any need to resist or question or complicate with the kind of independence that was really just fear disguised as strength. And as we watched the agents work, I realized that this moment represented not just the end of Marcus's empire, but the end of my own self-deception, the final death of the woman who had convinced herself that safety could be found in normalcy, when the truth was that safety had always existed in the arms of the most dangerous man I had ever known, the only man who had ever seen me clearly enough to love both my light and my darkness without trying to change either one. The documents Dante had arranged for me, the Swiss identity, the house overlooking Lake Geneva, the bank accounts that would have allowed me to disappear into a peaceful, anonymous existence far from the violence and complexity of his world, sat on Marcus's desk where Dante had placed them deliberately, a test I had not known I was taking until I understood what he was offering me and what it would cost us both if I accepted. "You could still go," he said quietly, his voice carefully neutral in that way he had when he was trying to give me space to make my own choices, even though I could feel the tension in his body, could sense the fear beneath his controlled exterior, that I might actually take this escape route he had prepared, despite everything we had been through together over the past month. I meant what I said before. I will not trap you here. Will not force you to stay in a world you spent 3 years trying to escape. Will not ask you to be something you are not just because it is convenient for me, or because we have history together that neither of us can quite let go of. I picked up the documents, feeling the weight of them in my hands, the promise of freedom and peace and a life unburdened by the constant awareness of violence simmering just beneath the surface of every interaction. And for a moment, just one brief, flickering moment, I let myself imagine what that life might look like, who I might become in Switzerland with a new name and a new history, and no connection to Dante Salvatore, or the world he ruled with such absolute authority. But the image would not come into focus, would not solidify into anything resembling desire or even curiosity, because the truth was that I had already tried to be that woman, had already spent 3 years attempting to build that peaceful, normal existence, and it had felt like wearing a costume that did not quite fit, playing a role in a production I had not auditioned for, pretending to be someone I fundamentally was not, while the real me, the woman who thrived on complexity and intensity, and the particular kind of intimacy that came from standing beside a man who could destroy the world and choosing to help him rebuild it instead, suffocated slowly beneath layers of denial and good intentions, and the kind of cowardice that disguised itself as moral superiority. "I do not want to start over somewhere else," I said, and my voice was steady and certain, and completely devoid of the hesitation or doubt that Dante might have been listening for, might have been hoping to use as an excuse to make this decision for me if I could not make it myself. I turned to face him fully, the the documents still in my hands but already meaningless, already transformed from a lifeline into simply more evidence of how thoroughly I had changed since that desperate night, when I appeared on his doorstep bleeding and broken and terrified. I want to start over here, with you, not because I have nowhere else to go, or because I am afraid of Marcus's associates seeking revenge, or because I have some romanticized notion about love conquering all obstacles, but because I finally understand something I should have understood 3 years ago. I was not running from your darkness, Dante. I was running from my own, from the part of me that loved the power and the danger and the intoxicating rush of being your queen, from the woman I was terrified to become because she did not fit into any category I had been taught to value or admire or even acknowledge as a legitimate way of being in the world. I tore the documents in half, then in half again, letting the pieces flutter to the floor like snow or ash, or the remnants of a life I would never live. And I watched Dante's face transform as he understood what I was choosing, what I was declaring with this gesture that was simultaneously destruction and creation, ending and beginning, the death of one version of myself and the birth of another, that had been waiting in the wings for permission to take center stage. I am done running from myself, I continued, stepping closer to him, closing the distance between us until there was no space left for doubt or misunderstanding, or the kind of careful politeness that people used when they were not quite ready to speak their full truth. I am done pretending that I can be soft and safe and uncomplicated when the reality is that I am none of those things, that I am sharp edges and moral ambiguity, and a woman who can watch a man be destroyed and feel satisfaction rather than horror. And I need you to understand that this choice I am making is not about you saving me or protecting me or giving me something I cannot give myself. It is about me finally claiming the crown I was always meant to wear, finally accepting that being your queen is not a compromise or a surrender, but the fullest expression of who I actually am, beneath all the layers of socialization and expectation and fear. Dante's control shattered like glass, his hands tangling in my hair as he pulled me into a kiss that tasted of relief and possession and 3 years of accumulated longing, finally given permission to exist without apology or restraint. And I kissed him back with equal fervor, my body remembering his with the ease of coming home after a long exile, my hands mapping the familiar territory of his chest and shoulders, and the strong column of his neck, while around us federal agents pointedly looked away and gave us the privacy of their deliberate inattention. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, both flushed with desire and emotion, and the overwhelming rightness of a decision made without reservation or doubt. And Dante rested his forehead against mine in that gesture of intimacy that meant more to me than any declaration of love, because it spoke of trust and partnership, and the kind of vulnerability that men like him rarely allowed anyone to witness. Our remarriage 3 weeks later was not the quiet, private affair I might have once imagined, but a massive display of power and intention that sent a clear message to every family and organization that operated in Dante's sphere of influence. Alessandra Salvatore was back, was claiming her place beside him as his equal, and his partner was no longer the naive girl who had run from this world, but a woman who understood its rules and had chosen to play by them with full awareness of what that choice meant and what it would cost her in terms of the peaceful existence she had once believed she wanted. I stood before the assembled families in a dress that was more armor than fashion, black silk that clung to my curves, and announced that I was not a victim or a trophy, but a force to be reckoned with in my own right. And when the time came for me to speak, because Dante had insisted that I address the gathering, that I make clear in my own words what my return meant, and what role I intended to play in the organization he had built. I looked out at the sea of faces, some friendly and some hostile and most carefully neutral, and I told them the truth without apology or embellishment. I left this world 3 years ago because I was afraid, I said, my voice carrying across the room with a strength I had not known I possessed until I was standing there claiming it. I was afraid of the violence and the complexity, and most of all, I was afraid of how much I loved it, how natural it felt to be part of this life. how completely I belonged here in ways that terrified me because they contradicted everything I had been taught about who I was supposed to be and what I was supposed to want. I paused, letting my words settle over the crowd, seeing understanding dawn in some faces and calculation in others, and knowing that my honesty was either the smartest or the stupidest thing I could offer these people who valued secrets and leverage above almost everything else. But I am not afraid anymore, not of this world and not of myself, and not of the woman I become when I stand beside Dante Salvatore as his wife and his partner and his equal. And I want everyone in this room to understand that I am not here because I have nowhere else to go. I am here because this is where I choose to be, where I belong, where I am most fully and honestly myself. And anyone who thinks my presence makes Dante weaker, or more vulnerable or easier to manipulate, should know that they are making a critical miscalculation that will cost them everything they value if they are foolish enough to act on it. The room erupted in applause that might have been genuine, or might have been politically expedient, or might have been some combination of both. And I felt Dante's hand find mine, his fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture that was both public claim and private reassurance. And as we left the ceremony together to face whatever came next, I felt the weight of my crown, invisible but absolutely real, heavy with responsibility, but lighter than the burden of denial I had been carrying for 3 years, a symbol of power and partnership, and the particular kind of freedom that came from finally accepting yourself completely, without reservation or apology. That night, alone in the penthouse that had become our sanctuary and our command center, and the place where we had rebuilt what we had lost and created something stronger from the ruins, Dante's hand came to rest on my stomach with a tenderness that contrasted with the hardness in his eyes when he asked the question he had been holding back for days, waiting for the right moment to voice what he suspected, but needed to hear confirmed. "Are you?" he asked simply, and I knew without him finishing the sentence what he was asking. What he had noticed in my body or my behavior, or the careful way I had been refusing wine at family gatherings. And I nodded because I had known for a week but had been waiting for this moment, for the privacy and the intimacy and the rightness of timing that would allow me to give him this news without the weight of everything else we had been dealing with, crowding out the joy and the terror and the profound significance of what we were about to undertake together. "I am pregnant," I confirmed, watching his face transform with an emotion so raw and unguarded that it reminded me why I loved him, why I had never stopped loving him even when I was married to another man and trying desperately to convince myself that I had moved on and built something better. And this time, nothing. Not fear, not violence, not the complications of this world we inhabit, or the dangers that come with your crown, will separate us, will make me run, will convince me that I need to protect our child from you when the truth is that you are the greatest protection anyone could ever have, the fiercest guardian, the most devoted father any child could hope for despite all the darkness that comes with your name. Dante pulled me into his arms with a desperation that spoke of 3 years of grief over the child we had lost, over the chance at fatherhood that had been stolen from him before he knew it existed, over all the might-have-beens that haunted the spaces between our words, and I held him just as tightly, understanding that this moment was not just about the baby growing inside me, but about healing old wounds, about choosing hope over fear, about building a future together that honored both who we were and who we were becoming. "You are mine, Alessandra," he whispered against my hair, his voice fierce with possession and promise and the kind of love that was as dangerous as it was devoted. "In this life and every one after, you are mine and I am yours, and our child will grow up knowing that they come from strength and love and a partnership that was forged in fire and emerged stronger for having been tested and broken and rebuilt into something that cannot be destroyed by anything except our own failure to choose each other every single day." "And you are mine," I replied, pulling back just enough to look into his eyes, to let him see the truth of what I felt, the completeness of my commitment, the totality of my surrender to this life and this love and this dangerous, beautiful future we were creating together. My beautiful monster, my impossible man, my king and my partner and the father of my child. And I promise you that I will never run again. Will never doubt what we have. Will never question whether I belong here because I finally understand that I was born for this darkness, made for this crown, destined to stand beside you and rule this empire we are building, not despite who we are, but because of it. And our child will inherit not just your name and your power, but also the understanding that love and violence can coexist, that strength comes in many forms, that being soft is not the same as being weak, and being fierce is not the same as being cruel, and that sometimes the most honest thing you can do is accept yourself completely. All the light and all the shadow, all the beauty and all the brutality, and find someone who sees all of it and loves you not despite your complexity, but because of it. Not despite your darkness, but because it matches their own, not despite the damage you carry, but because they understand that scars are proof of survival. And survival is the first step toward becoming something stronger than you ever imagined possible when you were busy running from the truth of who you always were.